You're listening the Virtual CISO podcast, providing the best insight on information security and security IT advice to business leaders everywhere.
Can you talk a little bit about these strategy engagements and why you feel so strongly that that's really the best starting point for somebody going through this thought process?
Yeah. I mean, the two of the main takeaways that you get from starting with a well-informed strategist is the education component of what all this is going to take. And then you can put a roadmap to paper of when you should be realistically trying for these things in order to dramatically increase your chance of success. So, John, like you were saying, I've been putting together sort of anecdotal evidence around this. I've not seen any official study. I don't have the records from PMO, and it's also very difficult because not all of them end up actually going to PMO. But it seems to be something on the order of like 40 to 60% of companies that start out on this FedRAMP journey abandon it halfway through, or sometimes even, further down the road than that. After all of this capital expenditure and all of this time, and sometimes they hire a 3PAO as an advisory and then find out like they're not getting the profitability out of this and this doesn't make business sense, and then they leave. Or it's way more costly than they thought it was going to be, and the decision maker of the purse strings wasn't set up for success with that executive communication at the outset, that we're looking at a time frame of 3 to 5 years of capital outlay, and then federal business contracts start, and then profitability from those contracts to where we're actually getting to like a return on equity point for this FedRAMP investment is like 5 years down the road, right? And that's great because it's such a high barrier to entry, right? Maybe that does work for you. Because if you're offering a unique service that's the federal government doesn't have, and you make it all the way through, you're the only one who's going to make it through for a while, right? Because it's so hard. If you do punch through to the other side, there's a lot of money to be made there, but you got to set the expectations up front, and that doesn't really exist inside of the ecosystem to help anybody figure that out, which is why I formed my company in the first place, because I have a real passion for this. I don't want to see people abandon it. I want to see people go all the way through. I want to see the government have access to better services and more competition in the cloud space. So let's talk about the education piece, right? All of the parts that this touches, it's been historically, right, a technical problem, and they at like the board and like C-suite level, it tends to be thought of as something as like just a SOC 2 audit. Think throw 30 grand at it. We'll write some policies. We'll go through, a $10,000, $20,000 audit, and then we'll come out FedRAMP authorized. And that is not the way this works at all. Couldn't be more different, right? And I tell my clients, like, this is much more aligned with the level of effort and thought and brain juice and investment of a product launch. A dedicated subset of your existing commercial product in the federal space to a unique customer with its own in unique market with its own unique requirements and preferences. And thinking of it more like a product launch, you are already way ahead of the curve and probably going to dramatically increase your chance of success from that alone. But to talk about all the different pieces that this is going to touch, and start planning out the time, the resources of this entire process sort of from end to end, and mapping out what that would look like so that you go through it with eyes wide open. I'm all for turning clients away and saying, you shouldn't go FedRAMP. It doesn't make any sense for you. Yeah, you could, but should you? And those that it does make sense for, I can help you get all the way through the process. I've done it a bunch of times, right? But it doesn't make sense if it doesn't make sense. So we talk about, right, the historically, like it's become like it's a technical implementation problem, and it's something that's thought of at like the engineer level. But really, this is something to be thinking about from the C-suite level from the beginning. This is going to be finance and the capital outlay that's going to be required, probably across multiple fiscal years. Maybe you can fit it in one, but I've rarely ever seen that even under the smallest companies that are already like federalized, right? Still take more than a fiscal year. So at least two. And you got to be thinking about those obligations in your liabilities going into year two, right? And thinking about what that's going to look like in your projections. Then we got to think about the technical implementation of your product as it exists today. Remember that that third-party FedRAMP requires that you have any external company or service that you're using that has any effect on security controls at all. And remember, this is very comprehensive across the board. If it has an impact on security controls, that external service also must be FedRAMP authorized. So that means that if you're using a CRM tool, and you use say Zoho or HubSpot right now as your CRM, your options inside of FedRAMP really are like Salesforce. Do you have Salesforce expertise, or do you need to hire people? Do you have Azure expertise, or are you going to have to hire people? So there's an HR component to it. There's so we map out like your organic skill sets from a technical perspective and what you have for delivery. But we also have to look at, the O&M costs of building out a platform that is compliant with the FAR if you aren't already. And the way the FAR requires it really is not intuitive. So very rarely have I seen a company who is, unless your book of business is already mostly in the federal government. And so we end up kind of looking at all of these different things: organic skill set, timeline. What is your ARR now? What do you project it to be in the future? What does your book of business look like now? What does your sales pipeline look like? How confident are you in those sales? In order to reach that return on equity point, it requires a continuous successful pipeline of federal sales in order to justify this investment in the first place. We look at all that stuff, right? And then we look at, if you don't have a federal business, looking at target agencies that are more likely to pick you up as a sponsor. So one of the examples that I use is like in the healthcare space. I have a lot of clients that come through that, come from that direction, right? Healthcare inside of the federal government is a subset of federal agencies. And so the demand for healthcare related services isn't going to be broadly expansive to, FBI and DOD and, all the intel agencies, all of those other sort of Cat 1s and national security space. You're going to be focusing on like VA, CMS, CDC, HHS, and it's just a smaller subset, right? So the FedRAMP website now allows you to look up the number of packages that an agency has sponsored, and you can see what those packages are. So you can look and sort of count out, right? How many have they sponsored before, and thus how likely are they to pick you up versus another agency? DOD and the VA have done like 3 FedRAMP authorization packages that they have sponsored so far in all 10 years of FedRAMP's history, mostly because they focus on DOD impact level because they're sort of DOD affiliated, right? So like HHS and CMS are sort of your way to go, and it's a better entry market into the federal space. And so we map all that out for you too, as well as like what is the roadmap and plan for sales pipeline and penetration, and what's the roadmap and plan for technical implementation, what's the roadmap and plan for architecture and FAR compliance in addition to FedRAMP compliance. And what are your organic skill sets? What do you have to hire? What's the end road, going to end up costing you in O&M? Then we can map all that stuff out, come up with a trajectory of what your sales pipeline would need to look like in order to get the ROI here. And we can give all of that information to you and then say, hey,